Please be seated. If you have attended our Sunday morning services for a while, you may notice a liturgical action that takes place while the altar is prepared for the Eucharistic prayer. One of the acolytes or servers takes a small pitcher and bowl and pours some water over the celebrant's hands and then offers the priest a small towel that's been placed on their arm. This liturgical washing actually has a name. It's called the lavabo, from the Latin word lavare, meaning to wash. That's L-A-V-A-B-O, lavabo. It may have started out centuries ago because of a physical need to cleanse one's hands. Nowadays, we have a bottle of disinfectant up there for that purpose. And it's also worth noting that this action of cleansing the celebrant's hands is not a liturgical requirement. So you won't see it in every Episcopal church. That being said, this remains a part of our liturgy because of its ceremonial meaning. And I experienced this in a very profound way in the first church I served as an assistant some 25 years ago. Paul Lawson, then rector of St. Cross Church in Hermosa Beach, is very energetic and outgoing. Under his leadership, there were all sorts of engaging activities. For example, he went surfing with a group of parishioners weekly. And both Carol and I were recruited for summer softball on the church's not one, not two, but 3 co-ed teams. This high level of engagement mattered to him. One of his first questions to me during my on-site interview was, "Can you play second base?" Seriously, and he was serious. He needed a woman second baseman. Sure, hadn't touched a bat in 30 years, but I could play second base. And yet, for all that activity, when Paul was the celebrant for Sunday Eucharist, there always was an extended pause after the lavabo, after the ceremonial washing of his hands. He would stand at the side of the altar as the acolyte put everything away and silently look up at the stained glass window above him for several seconds. And I'd never seen that sort of intentional, reverential pause before. When I asked him about his practice, hoping to learn its meaning, he said that it was the key moment during the Sunday service where he could prayerfully center himself before starting the words of consecration. And he would silently recall the words from Psalm 51, verse 10. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." Now, throughout my years of celebrating Holy Eucharist at many church altars, saying this prayer has been a part of my liturgical practice as the acolyte pours water over my hands. And actually, in some of the smaller churches I've served, I've said this verse out loud as a reminder of our collective intent to celebrate this great sacrament with a pure heart. Create in us a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within us. So, in today's gospel reading, we hear Jesus questioning the meaning behind some of the ceremonial traditions of his time. People were expected to not only wash their hands, but their utensils, along with food from the market before their meals. And this involved much more than just following basic rules of hygiene. These sacred acts of washing functioned as a concrete reminder of a person's sacred relationship with God. And as we heard at the start of our passage, the Pharisees accused some of the disciples of eating with defiled hands. And that word defiled is key. It means that they were ritually unclean. Much more than hygiene, they were ritually unclean. And Jesus questions the religious leaders' motives. For it seems that what was meant to be a reminder of one's relationship with the divine now was a way to separate others from the holy. And I have to admit, I love Jesus' response to the Pharisees' concerns. First, he quotes a passage from the prophet Isaiah, which they would know well. And that passage from Isaiah is where God laments that his people's hearts are far away from him, even though they do follow prescribed worship practices. And then he notes that this conversation with the Pharisees is not a private matter. It's happening in the context of a crowd who's been observing this interaction. And so he gives a teaching to the crowd where he challenges the religious rules and regulations of his time by telling those gathered, folks, there's nothing outside a person that by going in can defile. Now let's just pause for a moment. Imagine you're in that crowd. Do you have any idea how stunning those words would be? How stunning, even perhaps life-changing. For if our relationship with God becomes compromised, it is because of our thoughts, our temptations, our motives, our actions. And this is when we risk distancing ourselves from God and from others. One of my favorite authors, the Benedictine writer Kathleen Norris, writes in her book, Dakota, A Spiritual Journey, that sin in the New Testament is the failure to do concrete acts of love. It's not only breaking the rules, it's the failure to do concrete acts of love. And today's gospel invites us to reflect on the ways we choose or fail to choose to do concrete acts of love in our lives. And yes, we are invited to come face to face with the ways we have perhaps compromised our intentions. And I don't know about you, but I know that's difficult to do. And this is one of the reasons that our service includes a formal confession. For in our formal confession is where we acknowledge the ways we failed to live out our promises of loving God and loving others in God's name. And our confession isn't only about our shortcomings. It also includes our recognition that God's loving presence is always with us, always inviting us back to God's ways. We know that all life is linked together, love of God and love of neighbor, inner motivations, outward action, ritual, and practice. And Jesus invites us to be holy people by following his example. So, on this first Sunday in September, this first day of September, we find ourselves a little more than halfway through this somewhat lengthy season, the season after Pentecost. You may remember it started at the last Sunday of March, and it will go to the last Sunday of November. In some liturgical denominations, this lengthy season is also called ordinary time. And in this season, this lengthy season, this is when our readings and our Sunday collects emphasize the ways we are to live out our faith in the ordinary experiences of our life. For example, our passage from the letter of James exhorts us to be doers of the word, not merely hearers, be doers of the word. And our collect for this Sunday offers one of my favorite prayers from our Book of Common Prayer. Its rich imagery asks God to graft in our hearts the love of your name. Graft in our hearts the love of your name. This reminds us that we always have God's grace available to help us. The verb to graft has first a horticultural connotation. A bud or a shoot from one plant is grafted or inserted into a stem or stalk from another plant in which it continues to grow. This grafting requires skill and patience. There is a delicate alignment of the inner bark of the shoot with the inner bark of the receiving rootstock, so that eventually the two grow together as one. And the newly grafted shoots become fruit-producing branches. And as we know, we also have the medical connotation of using skin grafts for patients suffering with severe burns. This involves placing a new, different layer of skin on top of the burn area. Eventually, the transplanted skin graft will replace the burnt tissue as it connects with the patient's own skin, allowing the burn area to heal. Graft in our hearts the love of your name. Just as skin grafts are critical for a burn patient's physical health, the presence of God's love is critical for our spiritual health. Just as newly grafted shoots bear abundant fruit, we will bring forth the fruit of good works in our lives. Graft in our heart the love of your name. May this be our prayer, not only for this Sunday, but whenever we sense ourselves moving away from our calling to live out the gospel message. May our actions resonate with the interior urgings of God's holy presence. Amen.